From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
American voters render a split decision in Tuesday's midterm elections. Republicans appear to have won a narrow majority in the House, although a lot of races still to be decided. And if they do win that majority, they'd be putting a check on the progressive Democrats who have governed in the last 2 years. But there was no wave of support, as Republicans hoped, and Democrats may still keep the Senate with 4 seats still left to count. What do the results tell us about the state of our politics and the parties and what might happen in the next 2 years? Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal Opinion Pages and with my colleagues Kim Strausel and Kyle Peterson after what, at least for me, was a rather lengthy night. So if I sound even less coherent than normal, you'll know why here midday on Wednesday. Let's look at where we stand midday Wednesday. We still don't know which party will control either House of Congress, but the Republicans have a narrow edge in the House and could get to perhaps 222 seats from the 212 they hold now, which would, with some irony, be the mirror image of the current Democratic majority, but a far cry from where Republicans hoped to be. And in the Senate, the majority depends on the outcome in 4 states, Wisconsin, Nevada, Georgia, and Arizona. Ron Johnson looks likely to survive in Wisconsin. He's a Republican, and Mark Kelly, Democrat in Arizona. And Nevada's still counting and will be very close. If Adam Axel wins in Nevada, that would negate the Democratic win in Pennsylvania, taking Pat Toomey's seat, and it would make the Senate come down to, where have we heard this before, a runoff in Georgia on December 6th. Let's start off by listening to Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, talking on Tuesday night about the result.
It is clear that we are going to take the House back. We defeated the Democrat campaign chairman, Sean Patrick Maloney. Sean Patrick Maloney, which will be the first time in over 40 years the DCCC chair lost his reelection.
Kim, grasping at straws there, it's true the seat has been won now by Republicans, I gather, the Maloney seat, but a lot of other races they would rather have had and give up that one. Where do things stand now in the House?
Yeah, by the way, I would just say on that Maloney seat too, some people have called it, some people have not. So I think even that is grasping at straws a little bit. Here's where things stand in the House. You know, I actually had a list that I was keeping of all of the races that Real Clear Politics listed as toss-ups. Many of those were Democratic seats. When I went back through and checked all of them, Democrats held on to the significant majority of those, even many of the seats that RCP had listed as leans GOP. So that underlines that this was not a great night for the GOP, not as great as it could have been. And the reason we don't know exactly where things stand is that there have been a couple of clear pickups for Republicans so far. An important seat in Virginia, Elaine Luria, who lost 2 seats in Florida, a seat in Tennessee, a seat down on the Texas southern border. But then again, the GOP lost some of their seats too, including North Carolina 13, where Republican Bo Hines lost, a seat that Steve Chabot has held for quite a while in Ohio. There's a couple of more where they are struggling. And so what it ends up coming down to are a number of states where the counting is very, very slow, and we're not going to know for a while. And that in particular includes Pennsylvania, where there are about 3 seats up for contention, New York, where there are 3 or 4 up for contention, a whole bunch in California, where the voting is just crazy slow, and then a few other here and there. And so if Republicans manage to pull out a lot of those, yes, I think you get to 222, maybe a little bit more, but everything would have to go very well, and it's going to be a very narrow majority any way you cut it.
Well, do you think, Kim, that Nancy Pelosi could get to 218 and be Speaker again?
It's possible, although I would argue that he could end up with a majority that's narrower than she has now, which would be crazy hard in terms of governance.
But that's only 4 seats. If it's 222, that would be one of the narrowest in history.
Exactly. I think it's unlikely because there's a number of places where they really are looking good in terms of some pickup opportunities. Let's put it this way. Democrats would have to basically roll a straight to keep the majority, whereas things are working a little bit more in Republican Republicans' favor in that regard.
And in the Senate, Kyle, it looks like Johnson will prevail in Wisconsin when all the votes are counted. And it looks like Blake Masters will probably lose in Arizona, although all the votes aren't counted there. In Nevada, I think that Adam Laxalt-Cortez Masto race goes really down to the wire. We may not know until Friday when all the votes are counted there. But the Republicans have to have that to have a chance at holding the Senate. I mean, what happened in the Senate?
Well, to me, if you look at the Senate map, it is really a story of President Trump endorsing candidates with flaws that have a hard time winning in the general election. And we can go through some of these states. So Arizona is a state that when Governor Doug Ducey was up for re-election in 2018, he won by something like 14 points. And so there you have an obvious Senate candidate. The Republicans could have gone to Doug Ducey and said, we need you for the sake of the party, for the sake of the country, to run for the Senate, except that Doug Ducey had refused to entertain these 2020 election conspiracy theories endorsed by President Trump. And so President Trump made clear that he would go to war against Doug Ducey and stop him from being the Republican nominee. Similar dynamics in some of these other states. I mean, in Georgia, there were behind-the-scenes efforts by Republicans to get a nominee who was not Herschel Walker, and now we see why, because we have Governor Brian Kemp on the ballot there. Last I checked, some of these figures are still moving targets because they're still counting some ballots that were straggling in. But Brian Kemp is up by something like 5 to 8 points compared to Herschel Walker, who is down by something like a point below Senator Raphael Warnock. Or you could look to Ohio. Governor Mike DeWine there is getting a really solid victory, and that's a state where the Trump-endorsed candidate J.D. Vance won, but only by a handful of points. And by the way, it took tens of millions of dollars from the Senate Leadership Fund, the super PAC associated with Mitch McConnell, to get J.D. Vance over the finish line, and that's money that was not spent elsewhere.
Yeah, but Kyle, are you saying that from your point of view, the Senate majority, if Republicans don't gain it, is a function of Trump's meddling in the races to nominate bad candidates? Does this vindicate, in your view, Mitch McConnell's view from some months back, that much derided by the Trumpians, that candidate quality matters?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I can keep going. There's Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, who is lost to John Fetterman. Fetterman is a pretty left-wing candidate with vulnerabilities. He'd supported a fracking ban. He'd supported Medicare for all. And what's notable there is that Dr. Oz was never even a real Make America Great Again candidate. He was just a celebrity TV friend of Donald Trump. And the guy who lost the Republican primary, David McCormick, might have been a stronger nominee here. We might have had a Republican senator.
He would have been.
And you can look at some of these gubernatorial races too. I mean, Doug Mastriano won the Trump endorsement in Pennsylvania and the Republican nomination for governor, basically on the strength of his claims about fraud in the 2020 election. In Wisconsin, Tim Michels beat the former lieutenant governor, Rebecca Kleefisch, who might have had a better shot at taking out Governor Tony Evers. I mean, we're still parsing all the results and stuff, and like I said, some ballots are still being counted. But I think when all is said and done, Republicans will look at this map and see so many missed opportunities in what could have been a real great year for them, with inflation running at 8.5%.
Yeah, Kim, let's step back from the individual races here and kind of look at the big picture by looking at the exit polls and what they told us about what was on the voters' minds. The Republican opportunity just shouts at you here in the sense that something like 70% of the American public is unhappy with, who went into the voting booth, or unhappy with the state of the country. That argues for change against the party in power. You had the major issue in the race being inflation, the economy, runaway leader in that regard. That should have helped the Republicans as well. And it did to some extent. I think they hit that hard, and it did help them to some extent. But it's interesting to me that it wasn't enough, and crime wasn't enough, and immigration seemed to have been something of a bust as an issue, not least in Arizona. Meanwhile, abortion, I think it helped the Democrats in some places, particularly governor seats, governor races in the upper Midwest. It's striking to me that independents broke almost even. Republicans actually lost independents, who were about 31% of the vote, 49 to 47 in the exit polls. And that tells me that while voters are unhappy with the way the Democrats have governed, they really don't trust the Republicans yet to be a better alternative, or at least not enough of them do. Tens of millions of them don't. And so they just didn't vote for those candidates.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I think the Dobbs decision that came out, let's not undercount how important that might have been to Democrats in this turnout and the way that those numbers broke in the end. And that is a warning sign for Republicans that they need to get themselves straight on this question, think through how they're going to handle it, because as you mentioned, this seemed to work particularly well for governor's races in the Midwest, where I would note, for instance, in Michigan, abortion was on the ballot. And that certainly had to help in terms of Democratic turnout, which in turn helped Gretchen Whitmer keep her seat as governor. But in terms of those independent numbers as well, too, when you say that they don't trust Republicans, I think that's another way of saying that Democratic warnings that Republicans are extremists, which they managed to tie all to Trump, are still radiating out there. And it gets back to some of the points Kyle was making about the party needing to decide if they don't want to move on from a guy who, let's be honest, has at this point cost them the presidency, cost them the Senate at least twice, maybe more, cost them the House, and maybe again. And so that's the broader dynamic. They need to step away from that, but also I'd argue they need a little bit more of a positive agenda. I know that the House rolled out something. It was a couple of months ago, Kevin McCarthy, but it was a little vague. And honestly, if you look at the ads, so much of it was simply bashing on Democrats and not so much about what they were going to do to make things better. Now, that's always hard when you're the party out of power because there's no kind of natural leader of the party putting something like that together. But it's something they're also going to have to think about the next 2 years, especially if they do end up with the House and or the Senate and have an opportunity to pass some legislation.